issue there. Thank you very much. We'll now be going to Beth, who will be interviewing Patrick O'Donnell.
Union President. The Union President acts as the main spokesperson for USU, chairs the Union's Board of Trustees, and is responsible for the reputation, leadership and direction of USU as a democratic organisation. They work closely with the university's Vice-Chancellor and staff team, as well as key contacts in the City of York, and most importantly, students.
And welcome back to the final interview of Candidate Interview Night. I'm Beth Hardisty and I'm joined by current UC President Patrick O'Donnell. Thank you very much for coming on to URY's CIN and thank you for staying on so late. This is, of course, with you re-standing for the role of UC President, a bit more of a interesting sort of line of questioning with a lot of your manifesto promises, seeing as obviously you have a record in the role. What do you think is the difference between you now and you this year as a candidate, and you last year, sorry, as a candidate?
Well, obviously the context has changed this year. It's a really different context and it's really difficult for students, in terms of finances, in terms of grades. And certainly, when I wrote my manifesto, a year ago, I didn't have a clue, what the situation would be in that we're in at the moment. But, I really have spent the last few months, in this role, really doing my best to try and fight to protect students' grades and students' incomes. And a massive part of my campaign is, recognising the here and now and the things that we need to do together in terms of our asks, both to the government and to the university, but also making that long-term plan as we move out of restrictions over the next few months and we move to looking at what we can do to improve housing and finances, other things like that for students across the city.
And of course, your opinions will have changed over your time as UC Pres, as you're kind of faced with the realities of a lot of things. And of course, before you officially stepped into the role of Pres, you spoke to URY News about the place of pages and social media sort of institutions such as York Memes on campus, saying that language used in a specific instance was not representative, not reflective of what we are as a society, and it's not the kind of community that you wanted to be a part of. On Saturday, you responded to this very account about an idea to extend freshers' sort of rent and having a freshers' week as sort of a thing, saying that you were going to bring the idea to the VC. Given that these accounts haven't had anything change in terms of being condemned for what the university deemed as hate speech back in last February, has your stance on this affiliation with such pages changed, if nothing else has?
So I think it's important to break these issues down a little bit. So I responded to, I get students especially frequently on Facebook, on Instagram and everything. I've had messages today as well, obviously, and during the campaign. And I'm more than happy to speak with any student that gets in touch with me. So I was simply responding to a tagged post and I gave an informative response. And, I think the key issues that students are focusing on at the moment are things like graduation. And I'm really pleased that I've been working, really closely with the Vice-Chancellor to make sure that we can have at least 2 graduation ceremonies this year. I'm certainly asking for one in the summer, and obviously for international students and some people's families who may live abroad, obviously they may not be able to make that in the summer, so I'm also asking for one in the spring, and that's simply what I was referring to when I was speaking with them.
I mean, I guess the big question is whether or not you, as the Student Union Pres, talking to these accounts so publicly, obviously because they do show these responses on their stories, does that legitimise them as a platform? Because, of course, due to the fact that they're anonymous, which has meant that they have avoided any responsibility for their actions, you can't actually say whether or not they are students. I mean, it's presumed they are. You can't actually say how involved they are in life. You can't actually say, whether or not what they're saying is representative of the student body. Is it not your responsibility, due to the affiliation with them, for the USU to maybe look at whether or not this is a platform that you wish to legitimise?
So I don't think it's about legitimising it. I think, as I said, I'm simply answering questions when I'm asked. I'm more than happy, as I said, to answer questions from anybody. Just because I simply answer questions doesn't mean I have to agree with what people say. And, I will happily call out people where they do things wrong. And I have done so in the past, as you've quoted me saying. Yeah. So I think it's important to break down those separate issues. And as I've said, I'm more than happy to answer questions from people I disagree with and even agree with maybe sometimes. But I think it's important not to conflate different issues.
Yes. And so another point in your manifesto is that you want more club nights on campus. Obviously, again, you've had experience in the role. This is often a proposal that we see in a lot of manifestos. It is often something that comes under critique for the fact that, when you're looking at places like the RKC, it's just not really that viable as an option. Do you actually think that this is something that could be achieved, or is it just something that people put in their manifestos now?
Well, look, I'm really open-minded about, how we can build back to a really good nightlife in York and how we need to work across the city. So some of that is working with the council and independent venues like the Crescent, and I know candidates have spoken about that this evening. And I think it's absolutely vital because I've been working really closely with the council on issues like housing and licensing and things like that. So that's one element. But, I'm aware that loads of students also want to club out on campus, so I'm absolutely happy to support that and look to see what options we can figure out from that. And whether that's looking at the RKC, whether that's looking at the existing venues we have, I'm open-minded to looking at that. And it's also worth bearing in mind the absolute creativity that we've shown over the last few months with the Forest and with other venues, and actually the imagination of students to put on their own events. So maybe it's a case of not even USU putting on a club night, maybe it's our students themselves putting on club nights, which I think is really exciting.
And another thing in your manifesto is that you want to launch your own student lettings agency, SU Lettings. And I guess what most students will be looking at and questioning when they see that proposal is kind of two big things. What's going to incentivize any property owners to join something that maybe there's higher standards, or there's less money in it for them? And also, what's going to stop the SU from falling into the same traps that it seems as if every lettings agency for students around the country falls into, in terms of the negligence of some issues?
Yeah, so the main difference here will be it's led by students and it's for students. I think the key thing to do is to work with the council, and that's something I've been really passionate about, working, with partners across our city. And in terms of licensing and in terms of enforcing and upholding standards, it's important that we work closely with the council. But it's also about working closely with the university. I know that private housing providers like Vita, and there's others as well, are really keen to advertise with the university, and we can certainly use that. And obviously through that advertising, we'll generate an income, and that income can then be used to for housing enforcement, to make sure that students' rights are protected. So this really does pay for itself. I've actually already started those discussions with the university about how we can bring this sort of thing about. So it's in the pipeline and is frankly, ready to go for September.
And of course, in your time as Pres, you've launched a number of campaigns to lobby the government. In your manifesto, you reference Boris Johnson. Do you think your time as, being very closely affiliated with the University of York Labour Club as treasurer and other sort of political affiliations, do you think there's a risk of ostracising students that maybe don't agree with your political stances when you are their representative as the president of the Students' Union?
Genuinely not at all. I'm more than happy to work with anyone. I've worked with all different sorts of people, all different sorts of views. Last week I was meeting with the universities minister, who is famously not a member of the Labour Party. They're a Conservative government minister. I had a really constructive conversation with her. I'm really happy, to work with people across our city. We've got a multicoloured council of Liberal, Democrats and Greens as well on the council. I work with them frequently as well. So I'm more than happy to work with them and to put the interests of students first.
And kind of as your time here kind of winds to a close in the interview, what do you envision the University of York campus to look like as we kind of take the small paces out of lockdown and out of the pandemic?
Well, I think the first thing actually is to see people on campus, and it was really lovely over the weekend to have a walk around campus and see people back. So I really hope, over the next few months we can see people back on campus and around our city, and we can get back to doing what students love, and obviously doing that safely over the next few months. But we've got the Forest guaranteed now until the end of term, so I'm really hope as soon as it's safe to do so, we can get back to using those sorts of spaces and having a drink in the sun, because oh my goodness, aren't we all waiting for one?
And I guess the other thing as well is this is it's not very competitive in terms of the numbers as some other races, but there are a number of other people running for it. Kind of, why do you think students elect someone that they've had before rather than someone new?
Quite simply because my job isn't over just yet. I've got really clear plans, both for the short term in terms of how we're getting rent refunds and campaigning on tuition fees, but also there's long-term plans, as you mentioned, Beth, in terms of setting up that SU Let's housing agency. I've got that short-term and that long-term plan, but crucially, I've actually got the mechanisms in place of how I'm going to achieve them. And there's a full sort of breakdown of how I'm going to go around each of my policies on my link tree as well. So I think, my job isn't done yet, and I've really committed to delivering on what I promised students, and I think I've got a lot more to give.
And that is all we have time for today. And of course, the manifesto, along with all the manifestos, will be available on the website. But thank you very much for joining us here on Candidate Interview Night.
Cheers. Thanks, Beth.
And that brings Candidate Interview Night to a close. You've now heard from every candidate, each trying to convince you to give them your vote. And after this Friday, after debate night, you will have the opportunity to pick who you want to represent you. And before we leave you to either fall asleep or grab a drink, a huge thank you for this all being able to happen has to go to the URY Tech and Computing teams who have somehow managed to pull this out with so many limitations, as well as to all the interviewers and the candidates for joining us this evening. Thank you again for joining us for Candidate Interview Night, and I hope you all have a good night.